Hello everyone, my name is Daniel and I'm a programmer and an artist. This video is going to be part 6 in the series where I've been going through modeling a 3D game asset. The modeling's all done, and then we've turned that initial mesh that we modeled into a low poly version, and then we added a bunch of modifiers to it to make a high poly version, and now we're ready to bake the textures. And before we get into that, I just wanted to show examples of a couple ways you can add details to your high poly model. And one of those, which doesn't apply as much in this case, is text. If you just add a normal text object, you can give it a font and material and whatever, and then if you shrink wrap it to your high poly model, depending on where you place it, you can add that text detail in there in an easy way in the scene where you can edit it and move it around easily, because adding text to textures is actually kind of annoying sometimes. Another thing you can do is for like normal detail, as long as you stay close to the surface, depending on what you set your margin to for your bake, you can add details like this will just get baked into the normal map. Anyway, like these details here, all of these sort of nuts or rivets that are left in this are going to be that kind of detail on the wheel here. These spheres will be just baked in. This is just going to be baked in. The divisions in between is just going to be baked into the normal map. So there's lots of details that end up just being in the normal map in the low poly version, or the baked version. So that's really all I wanted to talk about for detailing. Other places where you could change it to just be detailing on this cannon barrel, you could potentially get rid of these rings and just have them be baked in the normal map. But since that's sort of the focal point of this, I mean, the barrel is one of the most visible central parts of the mesh. I'm going to actually leave those in, I think. Anyway, what I want to do now is make a copy of this low poly model and bake the detail from the high poly onto it so that the low poly looks the same as the high poly as much as possible. Now, I'm going to show two ways to do that. I've been working on an add-on for over a year that makes baking easier. And so the first way to do it is using my add-on. And then I will show for one texture how you would do it the manual way, both as an advertisement for my add-on, because I think it's much better, and also just to cover how you would do it manually if you only had to do it once or something. Anyway, if you're using my Bake Batcher add-on, I've already put everything in the collections. Note that I put some of these detail pieces in a collection called Skip Bake. And the reason I did that was because I'm not actually going to bake those from the high poly. I'm going to bake these ones over here, and then I'll instance those back on the mesh when we put it all together at the end. Other details, these spheres and these pieces on the wheels are going to be baked into it. So they are included in the high poly collection. So in the end, what we should end up with is all of these objects here. We need to make sure that they're realized in the collection to object node, and then they should all be in the Canon high poly collection. And then also these are in that collection. So that's everything in there. And then in the Canon low poly object, I have all of these objects in there, and all that they need to do is be lined up if you move them over with the high poly collection, which they are, because when I made a duplicate of the base before it was the high poly, to make the low poly, I just moved it 3 meters over on the y-axis. As far as my add-on goes, the only thing that's required for the name is that it ends in underscore high poly for the high poly collection, underscore HP that is, and it ends in underscore LP for the low poly collection. So that's how the add-on identifies which collections are paired. So this is the low poly and high poly of the Canon collection, essentially. So then all of these objects here in the low poly collection need to have a UV map, but they don't have to be packed at all. They can be a huge mess like this. The add-on will pack them when you bake, if you have pack UVs checked. So then to bake, simply select something, click bake. It'll say that it needs origin empties, and essentially that's an empty that will mark where the origin point will be on the newly created mesh. So this is the low poly, so we'll just put it right here, snap to the grid. And this is the high poly, so we'll snap it to the grid here. Make sure it's in the same place for both of them. So then once we have the empties in there and the settings are the way we want, we just have to select one of the objects and click Bake Collection, and then it will start baking all of the 5 standard PBR textures. If you have the console open, you can actually see what it's doing. So it's baking the base color right now. And one of my sort of the goals with this add-on was to make baking an asset, or baking all the textures and then applying that material to the low poly asset to feel more like pressing F12 to render your scene and see if it was looking the way you wanted your final image to look, and less like this whole process that's 50 steps long that you have to do. Then once you get to the end of it, you don't want to go back and redo it. Because when you're working on an asset, I feel like you often have to see what the final thing looks like, and then you'll realize 5 things that you need to tweak. Because I feel like a key part of the creative process for making a really good asset is being able to get to the final result and look at it and go, oh, there's these 2 things I want to change about it. But then feeling like you can go back and make those changes and repeat whatever part of the process you need to get back to the finished asset, and that's not going to take such a huge amount of time that you consider not doing it. So anyway, this is finished here. You can see that it's done. When it's done, it creates a copy of the low poly collection and applies the new material to it. So we should be able to see that our high poly and this low poly look basically identical from a certain distance anyway. If you get close, it'll break down a little bit. You start seeing individual pixels and stuff. But depends entirely on what scale you're supposed to see it from. So I'd say this one from this scale or farther away is good. And then as far as what I was saying about some things sometimes needing tweaking, I know if we look here at the barrel of the cannon, and we pull this up, if we turn correct face attributes off and pull this up, then you can see here sort of a problem where it got too close to the wood, and here it actually baked the wood texture into the barrel. So if we could see that, if it was something that we were concerned about, that being a problem or being noticeable for some reason, we could say, oh, I don't actually like that. Let me take these parts of the cannon and move them up like this. And then come over here to the barrel and move it up like this. And then that way, when we do the bake, it's not going to be rendering the wrong part of the mesh. And then we can simply go back to our tool here and bake the collection again. That's going to delete the previous baked model and redo the bake with part of the cannon barrel moved up so that it doesn't intersect with the carriage geometry when it's doing the bake. Also, when you're previewing this, you can set the bake resolution to be like 256 or 512, and then it'll bake very quickly. And obviously you'll have a low resolution with the result, but it'll usually show you where the problems are still. And then only when you're done so you can use a low resolution to find some of those problems, which makes your process faster. And then once you're done and you feel like everything's good, then you can turn your resolution up, because it does take a while to bake 2048 by 2048 textures in this case, depending on your graphics card, obviously. So then when it's done, we get a new version of the model. Now we can see that we don't have those problems here where it rendered the carriage into the barrel. And you could do that for as many different things as you wanted to tweak, as you found. So yeah, that's the baking process if you're using my Bake Batcher add-on. If you are not using my Bake Batcher add-on and you're to do this all manually, this is how you would do that. You would need to add some sort of an object, and I would add a collection to object. And I would add a collection to object modifier, and then I would select the low poly collection, and I'd pick an object to be the origin here. I'd realize it, and then I'd make that a mesh. Then I'd make a copy of that, and I'd add another collection to object node, and I would do the high poly collection, and I would pick a origin for that, and then I would realize it, and I'd convert that to a mesh. Then I would take both of those and I'd move them way up out of the way. And then on this high poly one, I would go to the material, and in the material I would add an image texture. You'd make a new image texture, whatever size you wanted, and I'd call it bake. And I'd make sure that that node was selected. Once you've done that, then you can go to your materials, and I would take the whatever whatever map I wanted to bake. So let's start with the base color. I'd plug that directly into the surface output. Then I would go to all of the other materials and I'd connect their base color directly to the output. And in this case, you can see we immediately have a problem because in my shader, I apply a tint. So that doesn't work here, but we could do it out here. Instead, the annoying thing is that you have to edit all the materials. Then once I add the base color there, the reason you have to do the base color directly to the output is because if you try to bake, for example, the diffuse and you just bake the color map, if you have any roughness on your shader, so if you're using like a PBR shader and you have the roughness at 0.5, well then half of the base color texture gets put in this diffuse bake type and the other half gets put in the glossy bake type. And because of that, it's kind of useless. So the only way to easily bake just the actual base color texture is to bake using emit and to plug your base color image directly into the surface output. So now this is ready to set up and ready to bake the base color. We need to make sure this has UVs, so we'd have to come in here and select all of this. One thing that's a problem here is these UVs are all different sizes, and ideally you'd want to unify the texel density so right now the carriage part of the cannon's probably got more pixels per square inch than other parts of this do. And so you'd want to make all of those the same size or make the more important or more visible part slightly bigger potentially, but I don't think there's an easy way to do that. I guess you can average island scale. That might work. Anyway, but then you want to pack the UV islands. And then that'll take a second. Then your UVs are all packed into the island, and that's good to go. Then you would want to move this. You'd want to select the high poly and then select the low poly, and then snap both of those to the cursor so that they're overlapping. Then you want to go to your render settings. You have to be using cycles. You want to make sure you have the right bake type selected. You want to check selected to active. Set your extrusion distance if you need to do that. Your target should be the image texture, which is going to be those textures that we selected. Oh, I forgot. On the low poly model here, you're going to want to make a new material. Call it bake. And then it doesn't really matter what's in it. I forgot. We're not actually baking the materials in the high poly. So all we needed to do there wasn't to create the bake image. We just had to plug the base color into the output. But here we do need the bake image, and that node needs to be selected. If you were baking from the high poly to the high poly, which sometimes they do for like character models, then in that case you would need the images in all of your shaders. Anyway, we need a material with a bake image on the low poly. So then we want to make sure we select our high poly, and then we select our low poly, which is hard to do. So I would go over here. This is the low poly, so we're going to select the high poly, then select the low poly. Now in the bake settings, everything's right, so we can click bake. This is going to bake the base color texture, which it is done. Now we have the base color here. We need to make sure to save this as an image. So we'd have to come in here, save this, give it a name, save the image. Then we would exit out of that, and we'd have to go back to our high poly. We need to go to all of the materials, and we need to connect, say, the metallic now to the surface. Go to the wood, find the metallic, connect it to the surface. Then we'd have to select everything again, do another bake, save that image as the metallic, and we'd have to repeat that for all of the different maps that we wanted. So that would be how you would do it manually without the add-on. Obviously, the add-on is much faster, and I highly recommend using something like that. If you don't like mine, there's other options out there as well. Anyway, let's get rid of this and reset our materials. All right, I've put the materials back together. We've got our baked low poly here. I think that's all I want to cover in this video. In the next episode, we will assemble the model. Put the mirror modifier on the parts that need to be mirrored, and move the cannon barrel back down. Scatter these detail pieces where they need to go on the model. It should be pretty quick. And then I want to cover rigging it so it can be animated, and then I want to make an animation for it still. So hopefully that was a good overview of the baking process. Earlier this week, my baking add-on came out on Blender Market, so you can go over there and check that out. There'll be a link to that in the description. Other than that, that's all I've got for this one. Thanks for watching.